Many kinds of flow meters measure flow by physically separating the fluid into specific quantities that can be counted and passed on. This principle of operation is sometimes called positive displacement, and it involves measuring individual amounts of fluid so that a total flow value can be determined. Since these types of meters in essence measure fluid flow directly, we'll refer to them as direct flow meters. This oval gear meter is one example of a flow meter that uses positive displacement to measure total flow. As this simplified illustration shows, there are two oval gears inside of the meter. The flow of the fluid causes the gears to rotate. As they rotate, specific amounts of fluid are trapped in the chambers between the gears and the meter body. So each time the gears rotate, a precise amount of fluid is passed along. If the flow increases, the gears speed up, but they still pass the same precise amount of fluid along with each rotation. A counter mechanism counts each rotation of the gears to determine the total flow of fluid through the meter. Another example of a flow meter that measures flow directly is this Nutating Disk meter. It gets its name from the action of the disk, which can be seen here. The word nutate means to wobble or roll about an axis of rotation. During operation, the disk rotates much like a slowly spinning top. As the disk rotates, specific amounts of fluid are trapped above and then below the disk. An increase in flow will cause the disk to rotate faster, but the same amount of fluid will be passed along with each rotation. The Nutating Disk meter counts the precise amounts of fluid passing through it to determine total flow. Some flow meters do not measure the flow of a fluid directly. Instead, they measure some physical aspect of the fluid, such as velocity, pressure, or level, and then convert that measurement into a corresponding flow value. In other words, they provide a flow measurement indirectly. For that reason, we'll call these types of meters indirect flow meters. Here's one example of a device that provides a flow measurement indirectly. In this arrangement, a thin plate with a hole in its center, known as an Orifice Plate, is used to restrict the flow of fluid through a pipe. When fluid flows through the orifice, the pressure on the upstream side of the plate is greater than the pressure on the downstream side. The difference between the two pressures is proportional to the flow rate of the fluid through the plate. The greater the difference between the two pressures, the greater the flow rate. A differential pressure, or DP cell, measures the difference between the two pressures and converts that value to a flow rate signal. The flow rate signal can be used to provide a local indication, or it can be transmitted to a remote indicating device. Now, in this example, an orifice plate was used to create a differential pressure, but other pipeline restrictions can be used to accomplish the same thing. Another type of flow meter that uses differential pressure to measure flow rate is a rotameter. In a rotameter, fluid passes through an inlet and enters a tapered tube. Inside the tube is a plummet or float that acts as a restriction in the flow path of the fluid. Fluid flow through the tube causes a differential pressure to develop across the float. The differential pressure causes the float to rise and fall as flow rate changes. The greater the flow rate, the greater the differential pressure and the higher the float rises. If the flow rate decreases, the float drops. The tube has a scale next to it that indicates the rate of flow. Flow rate readings are generally taken at the widest part of the float. Now, not all flow measurement devices are used to measure flow in enclosed passages like pipes. Some are used in open passages. These devices are often called open channel flow devices. One type of open channel flow device uses a weir. A weir is basically a dam with a notch at its top. In this arrangement, the level of the fluid behind the weir is used to determine flow rate indirectly. A weir works like this. When fluid enters the channel, it builds up behind the weir and overflows through the notch. The level in the channel stabilizes when the amount of fluid flowing through the notch equals the amount of fluid entering the channel. If the flow rate of the fluid entering the channel increases, the level behind the weir rises until an equal amount of fluid flows through the notch. So the level of fluid behind the weir is directly related to the flow through the channel. A level measuring device continuously measures the level behind the weir and converts that value to a flow rate signal. The signal is typically transmitted to a recorder where it can be read. Another group of flow meters uses fluid velocity to determine flow rate. Now, keep in mind that flow rate and velocity are not the same thing. The flow rate of a fluid is the quantity of fluid that flows past a given point at any given time. Velocity is the speed at which fluid flows. An example of a meter that uses fluid velocity to determine flow rate is a turbine flow meter. As this simplified illustration shows, a turbine flow meter has blades that are attached to a rotor. The rotor is placed in the path of the fluid flow. As fluid passes around the blades, the turbine begins to rotate. The speed of the rotation is proportional to the speed of the fluid. The number of rotations that the turbine makes is converted to an indication of flow rate. In this topic, we talked about what fluid flow is, and we looked at some of the devices commonly used to measure fluid flow. We categorized the devices that we saw as direct flow measurement devices and indirect flow measurement devices. Now let's try some practice questions about flow measurement. Two types of flow measurements that are often made are flow rate measurements and total flow measurements. Flow rate can be thought of as the amount of fluid that's passing some point at any given time. Total flow, on the other hand, can be thought of as the total amount of fluid that has passed a designated point. The Nutating Disk meter counts the precise amounts of fluid passing through it to determine total flow. When fluid flows through the orifice, the pressure on the upstream side of the plate is greater than the pressure on the downstream side. The difference between the two pressures is proportional to the flow rate of the fluid through the plate. The greater the difference between the two pressures, the greater the flow rate. A differential pressure, or DP cell, measures the difference between the two pressures and converts that value to a flow rate signal. The flow rate signal can be used to provide a local indication, or it can be transmitted to a remote indicating device.